Hello, everyone. Thank you all for your time today. My name is Jeremy Glassenberg, and today we'll be talking about API design in FinTech. We're basically going to go through a bit of the modern history of FinTech APIs, some trends in the field, and tips for those who are either building APIs for FinTech and future prospects for those as well who are integrating with many FinTech APIs. First, a little bit about myself. Basically, I've been working on APIs for a long time in a range of industries and a variety of companies, including many fintech companies, such as in supply chain financing and invoicing over at TradeShift, working on the credit card platform space at Deserve, and then also supporting many other fintech startups as an advisor. Most recently, I've been leading API governance at DocuSign, not fintech, but doing a lot of stuff still on the API side of things in B2B, and still plenty of time working within fintech. Now, what I want to get into today to really start things off with the trends I've been seeing in working in fintech and working with fintech APIs. I want to first really start with some early history of fintech APIs. I'm curious how many of you may remember the days of EDI, electronic data interchange. I found actually one person who really liked EDI as a standard. Yeah, just kidding. But this was, in fact, notorious as this like nightmarish legacy system for those who've had to work with it at all any time in the last decade. It's heavy, it's not easy to use, but in actuality, it was quite innovative for its time. This framework actually predated the modern internet, and so it kind of predated modern APIs, certainly predated JSON. So it was this brilliant idea to help to create a standardized format by which various financial institutions could actually interact through technology, even though it's really a pain to use by modern standards. That said, let's take a look at where things are if we move just, a few years down the road and, the not too distant past. What else do we see more recently? Well, unfortunately, in the world of financial technology, there's a lot of site scraping. And we saw the impact here as well. We had products that weren't reliable, but also had security issues. Many of us may remember Mint. It was acquired by Intuit, most recently shut down. It's now part of Credit Karma. But this is a personal finance service that would allow you to track how your credit card spend. They were tracking basically your income against your costs, helping you to basically watch your budget. And in order to do so, it had to integrate with many different banks and brokerages and other financial institutions that you use. And they did so by prompting you to provide your username and password for every one of these services so that they could site scrape. Besides being unreliable, it also wasn't the most secure, as Mint had to, in order to work, obtain the passwords to every one of your bank accounts. Why did it have to do this? Why did it have to resort to site scraping? Well, let's get the perspective from the financial institutions at the time. Basically, they weren't so privy to integrations to open data. They really wanted to maintain full control of their data. In actuality, they wanted full control of your data. And while other companies and the rest of the tech industry learned the benefits of opening up this information, the power of sharing, banks weren't so open to that. Luckily, eventually came legislation, basically laws that forced banks in the United States and in Europe to open up. So here in the US, we basically have open banking. This is a standard that really forced banks to give people better access to their data. Over in Europe, there's PSD2. PSD2 is basically a regulation for electronic payment services to make payments more secure, to boost innovation, and to help to adapt new technologies. But basically, these new regulations, new laws, basically required banks to open up more for their users, to innovate more technologically, and indirectly to basically have APIs. It didn't explicitly require APIs, but the best solution to actually meeting these regulations was, in fact, APIs. And now we can work more reliably with banks, with credit card companies, with brokerages through APIs instead of through site scraping. And what I especially love is how many of these banks are now going with OAuth so that we don't have to pass our passwords around with all of these third-party fintech solutions. So newer fintech companies, thanks to the requirement, the forcing really of modern APIs from institutions having to open up, has led to integrations that are easier to use, more reliable, and more secure. Basically, it's a good time to be in fintech in these last few years. At the same time, well, there's a lot going on within fintech. Beyond the banks opening up, we're seeing many new technology companies in the fintech space who really know APIs. So while the banks have been difficult, we've seen still in just the space of fintech in general some very good talent taking advantage of the opportunity for fintech and the opportunity for APIs, coming in and really setting a high bar for APIs in the fintech space. For instance, Stripe, which to many of us is basically like the gold standard in APIs, they're credited for basically founding three-column documentation for API references. This is why most of us, when in doubt, say, if we're not sure about some specific aspect of an API strategy, we'll ask, what would Stripe do? Or what would they have done when they were in our stage? But yeah, we've seen how consistently the fintech companies really are delivering high quality APIs and are setting the bar and becoming really leaders, thought leaders, in how to provide a good developer experience. Now, what this means then for you, if you are looking to build a company in fintech and launch some APIs, there is a high bar here. You're going to be expected to abide by some very strong standards for high quality APIs and a good developer experience. At the same time, you also have good benchmarks by looking at what other fintech companies are doing and trying to be consistent with the rest of the industry. And this is something that I generally advocate in any industry. Try to make integrations easier by having standards not only within your company, but having consistency across the APIs within an industry. So anyone who's working with other related companies can work with your APIs more easily. And so there's this push for open banking. We have more APIs now. We have some really good companies working in this space. There is a gap that I've noticed, though. Coming back to industry standards. Yes, there are industry standards, but much of what I'm seeing is actually kind of old if we go back to like the time of EDI. That would be the ISO 222 standard. That's the EDI standard. So we do have some messaging standards, but they're kind of legacy. We do have standards for like credit card processing. When I worked at Deserve, we encountered that ISO 8583. So there are standards for how the messages when it comes to handling transactions, processing approval of a credit card transaction. Yeah, that has to be done. That requires the use of a standard. But when it comes to REST APIs or GraphQL APIs, do we see any industry standard around that? Not really. Open banking and PSD2 really push companies to have APIs, but it didn't provide anything specific. In other words, when it comes to modern APIs, to really interact with these different fintech companies or banks and other financial institutions, we don't really have rules for the specifics of the design. We actually just have guidelines. Now, this isn't the only industry where people, dream of seeing APIs become more consistent. Not just having them all being RESTful, but if working in a similar space, doing something similar, having the same look and feel and interoperability for those who want to integrate with many services. Now, while there aren't any official standards, I have noticed in looking at working with many fintech companies and fintech APIs patterns. And that can help us if we're building our own FinTech APIs to at least unofficially get a certain level of consistency. When working with the financial institutions, because they often don't have as much expertise in building APIs, they're going to third-party solutions like Swift to get help building APIs. So on the positive, we are seeing banks being somewhat consistent with APIs. But also, when we look at the Stripes, the Plaids, Marquettas, Squares of the world, there are some patterns that I can see and some trends that I want to look at so that we can be consistent in our API designs if we're building a FinTech API. Um, High level here, a few clear examples we've noticed. One, when it comes to API properties, in particular, currencies, for instance, we do see a consistent type definition for certain properties. Like basically for currency, while there isn't a standard, in fact, OpenAPI doesn't have a particular standard for currency. We've basically seen, if you look at Plaid, Stripe, Marqeta, all of them are actually kind of doing the same thing. They're basically making sure to have integers and a currency code that's a string enumerator specifying what kind of currency it is. They have all gone with integer, not float, basically finding it just easy to calculate, efficient to store the information. Let's take a look at endpoints and model definitions as well. Well, here, unfortunately, I don't see consistency. If you want to work with a credit card or a transaction or a bank account balance, well, it's going to be a different object every time. This is not going to be that interoperable. That said, what I do see is that for any set of APIs, like within Stripe, within Marqeta, within Plaid, they are clearly positioning within their own APIs consistency in design. And this is where I encourage, and this comes up in separate talks here, I'm sure, the topic of API standardization, API governance. It definitely is an expectation that whatever you define as an object, you want to be reusable within your own APIs. So I would say here, just set a standard for your own APIs and really stick with it. That said, keep a lookout. I think we're going to start to see some model reuse happening across the industry as well in order to allow our APIs to become more interoperable. Another common trend is that of item potency, which just makes sense as something that's going to be more common in the world of FinTech APIs. For those less familiar with item potency, the idea here is that you basically are watching out for a scenario where someone may make the same post request twice because they're not sure if the first time they made the post request to create an object that the post request went through. It's possible that it was successful, but it didn't return success. And so the item potency key makes sure that you don't make a duplicate call. So in FinTech, we especially don't want someone making the same transaction twice accidentally. So it's very, very common to provide the item potency parameter as an option for creation requests in your APIs. Also, when it comes to authentication, yeah, obviously OAuth is the standard. I should also know when it comes to OAuth, in particular OAuth 2, I see that encrypted signatures are being required as well. This is not a requirement of the OAuth 2 standard, but really across the world of FinTech. In addition to having SSL, they do require the encrypted private signatures as part of the API requests. Now, I should note, though, that this happens for direct consumer to API interactions, client to server interactions. Often in FinTech, integrations are happening server to server. And when that happens, and for those scenarios, I actually see more basic authentication. In fact, it's common if you look at Stripe and Marqeta to see some APIs that require OAuth and other APIs that require basic auth. And that's just the nature of the use cases for these APIs. Certain APIs are meant to be called client-side. Certain APIs are meant to be called by customers strictly server to server, where OAuth really doesn't make as much sense. So they figured out how to really split this up, make sure it's clear where to apply basic auth, where to apply OAuth, based on use case. Relatedly to this, though, an understanding that sometimes a call is going to be made internally and others are going to be made for your consumers to potentially see. So the importance of authorization alongside with authentication and really having well-planned scopes and permissions, especially divided among those APIs meant to be server to server and among those APIs that are meant for client to server calls. For instance, over at Marqeta, there's a basic auth for an admin API to basically find all the users, say, for a company's account. Marqeta, by the way, is a debit card company. So if I, as a customer, I'm creating debit cards for consumers, I need to be able to access all the users and, check on their statuses or whatnot. So I'll need a scope to have administrative functionality to get information on specific users with their debit cards. But if I'm going to perform an operation on behalf of a user, I can use the admin access token to obtain a user level access token that only has permission to perform interactions on behalf of that user. So we're seeing scopes and permissions, not just when it comes to, OAuth versus basic auth, but really when it comes to admin functionality and user level functionality. And often having a way by which from the admin access tokens, you can obtain a user level access token to perform operations on behalf of a user, but safely. So these are common challenges and as a result, there's a pattern in the solutions in having basic auth, OAuth, and then really investing in watching scopes and permissions. Arguably, this also relates to compliance requirements, like in the credit card industry, PCI, payment card industry compliance. There's a lot of regulation about restricting card access to cardholder data on a need-to-know basis. That would also mean within your code, making sure that you're not having access to other users just by nature of the access token that you have. Finally, outside of the APIs themselves, there's an understanding that if I'm, making an app that's handling, financial transactions, I should be able to test that in a safe environment. So yeah, having a system of sandbox accounts, demo environments is vital across the board. I do see differences in design of these sandboxes, so hopefully we're going to see more support in providing API sandboxes in our infrastructure going forward, but basically assume that you're going to need to provide some sort of sandbox environment for your developers if you're building an API in this space. Now, when we talk about expectations, trends, some patterns to try to utilize, and the dream of consistency, again, there's that issue of APIs ultimately not being consistent. I noted here some trends, some patterns, but again, standards like requirements under open banking, they don't actually establish standards for the API design. So is there anything else we can do to support API consistency in FinTech, besides watching what others are doing and trying to keep consistency in our own APIs? Well, there is the matter of incentivizing consistency. And if your fintech company is positioned to potentially do this, I really encourage it. We see that with those companies that are providing APIs for financial institutions, that they're probably making them consistent in design as they work company by company. And then over at Plaid, I love this thing they established, the Plaid Exchange. It basically allows financial institutions to integrate into Plaid themselves rather than having Plaid integrate with all the financial institutions. Plaid's gotten big enough, they have enough leverage, they can encourage institutions to go and build an integration into Plaid. And if you look at the instructions as to how Plaid does this, any financial institution will then have to create an API, a set of APIs that meets Plaid's requirements to integrate. In other words, in order to integrate with Plaid, you're going to have an API that's consistent with the other APIs that are integrating with Plaid. So Plaid, by becoming large enough, by providing this incentive for companies to integrate, they're pushing institutions to actually be consistent in the design of their APIs. This is something I was very happy to see, and I'm hoping to see other companies help to push financial institutions and other fintech companies to go with a more common industry standard, get us to an industry standard, to really have consistency and interoperability across our fintech APIs. All right, that's all for today. Thank you all for your time. I'll emphasize again, keep that bar high for fintech APIs, collaborate with other companies in the space to try to get consistency, and we will have a better and better, easier to use, growing fintech ecosystem. Thank you again for your time today.